So good evening, everyone. It's 6 o'clock. We wait probably another minute or two so that everyone has the chance to dial in, and then we will start. Okay, as promised, these were the 2 minutes. Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to all. Yes, we are all aware the COVID pandemic has had a very firm grip on the economy and shows that we all need to rethink and innovate in some areas to be prepared for the future. And in particular, in the healthcare industry, our today's focus, on both sides of the Atlantic, we've seen political demands for renationalization and trade barriers have been rising. But I strongly believe, and I think also the AmCham Germany believes, global challenges require still cross-border cooperation, in particular between the US and Europe. My name is Henning Schneider. I'm chair of the AmCham Northern German chapter, and I'm also attorney and partner with Latham. Our today's topics, you've seen it in the invitation, is learning from the pandemic, how to strengthen transatlantic cooperation in the healthcare industry. And first of all, this is combined with a very big thank you to our sponsor, to Johnson & Johnson, who is supporting our today's event as a non-profit organization. We need the support of companies like Johnson & Johnson to support us in our events and activities. And the idea is to hear from two renowned experts in the healthcare industry from both sides of the Atlantic about their views with a focus on some of the relevant questions. So I'm happy, more than happy and honored to welcome our two guests and speakers here of the panel. The one with the name Johnson, not Johnson in his back is Kristof Boogaerts from Johnson & Johnson Medical Germany, GmbH. And the other one is Ben Haas, Latham & Watkins, based in DC. So Kristof is a managing director of Johnson & Johnson's Medical Device Germany, with, I think it's fair to say, many years of professional experience in the industry and also with expertise in other well-known companies. He is one of the leading experts and managers in this field. I think Kristof has, if I have calculated correctly, more than 20 years. You look so young, Kristof, but already 20 years of experience. With a certain focus on hospital and healthcare industry. Ben is like me. He is a partner of mine, a partner at Latham & Watkins, based in the US, based in Washington, DC, with a strong healthcare life science practice on and focus on regulatory transactional matters involving medical device, pharmaceutical and biotech industries. And he's also one of our experts for regulatory matters like the FDA, US Food and Drug Administration. authority. Before we start, some formalities and how we will organize the next 60 minutes. Ben will start with an introductory overview of about 10 minutes, 12 minutes. Then Kristof will give his reply with his thoughts, and we will then go to discussion among the two panelists, but also with a Q&A. We will record the session. Please stay on mute. And as to the Q&A, you will stay on mute. This is the format. This is organized like this. But you have the chance to use the Q&A tool, and we will then, the AmCham, with the help of the AmCham and myself, we will then look into the Q&A tool and will then select questions from the Q&A. And it would also great if you could, when you put the question in the Q&A tool, mention also your name and the company. So after the formalities, after the welcome, I would suggest, dear Ben, you start. Please take over. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Henning. And it's a real pleasure to be invited to join today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Just a little bit of additional background on my practice. I'm a specialist in US FDA regulatory matters. And over the 20 years of my career, I focused on helping, particularly in the US and overseas in Europe, emerging companies with new technologies bring their products through the clinical trial process, and in the US through the US FDA authorization process. So long track record of experience, and had some real insights into the nimbleness with which FDA approached issues related to the pandemic. And at the end of my brief intro, I'll sort of highlight some opportunities for both companies here in the States and more importantly for companies overseas to sort of use the novel mechanisms that FDA has established to help facilitate cooperation, introduction of new technologies, whether we're talking about in response to the pandemic or otherwise. But before I get there, I thought I would provide some perspectives from the US on how the pandemic was handled, lessons learned, and as we move forward, the key priorities that have been articulated by the Biden administration, Congress, and FDA to implement those lessons learned in a meaningful way, such that we can expedite responses to future pandemics and the approval of new medications. Let me start by saying there's no doubt that COVID put a further strain, really, on US-European relations. A lot of it comes from the tenor of the Trump administration back to 2016. But in hearkening back to the Ebola crisis of 2014, 2016, our ability to cooperate was held up as a model of how to address pandemics or potential pandemics. And, fortunately, we didn't see the same type of cooperation around COVID. First we had travel bans almost immediately. Fortunately for my practice, we have Zoom and other platforms that allowed me to continue communicating seamlessly with my clients. But with the travel ban created an air of mistrust and sort of nationalization of the response to the pandemic in each case. As everyone knows, the U.S. also announced its withdrawal from WHO, and which Biden has recently reversed. But another sort of area where cooperation could have facilitated a response to the pandemic, where the U.S. rather retrenched. And finally, and this is what I saw a lot in sort of my day-to-day practice, was real competition, a Wild West atmosphere for PPE, medical equipment, R&D, reagents and things necessary to develop new therapeutics among my U.S. clients, among our European clients, and so on. I mean, the U.S. suffered from significant shortages of critical medical supplies needed for healthcare workers in the early days of the pandemic. and global demand for key products like reagents and testing supplies put a significant strain on the healthcare system in the U.S. Ultimately, the U.S. allocated over $1 billion for subsidies to expand capacity across the U.S. supply chain here in the States for PPE, not just for products like surgical masks and gloves, but also critical inputs like fibers, rubber, and filters needed to manufacture those products. There's, as we look forward, there's a percolating concern about what happens to that supply chain and the sustainability of it after the pandemic, given pricing pressures and so on. And I know from my contacts in Congress that a real area of cooperation, maybe with Europe and Germany in particular, may be around or surround sort of the PPE supply chain. As I signaled, Biden has sought to ease the tension since he took office this past January. First and foremost, he indicated his desire to halt the withdrawal from WHO. The Biden administration has announced a commitment of up to $4 billion to COVAX, the WHO-led initiative to deliver vaccines and therapeutics around the world. The concerns that COVAX is trying to address through cooperation with the U.S. and others is, first supply, making sure that countries like the U.S. and Germany don't prioritize their own population, for instance, with the booster, but rather prioritize getting vaccine out to those countries with low vaccination rates. Allocation, we need to address indemnities, liability protections for the vaccine manufacturers when they distribute product for humanitarian reasons in these low vaccination rate countries. And finally, administration. We in the U.S. And in Europe need to combat the ongoing misinformation, sometimes propagated by Russia and Germany, misinformation regarding vaccines. And the hesitancy that creates among both of our domestic populations, but also around the world. So there's a combined effort to really educate not only our domestic populations, but the world at large regarding the success of vaccines in combating the pandemic. When we look at Congress, Congress shares the priority to re-engage with Europe in a manner not only to address the current pandemic, but to address future pandemics as well. So, just taking through some key congressional priorities. The first is to improve preparedness and early warning of global health threats through forums such as NATO and the G7. So, certainly where the Trump administration had sort of walked away from those forums for cooperation, Congress is committed, the Democratic Congress is committed to re-engaging in those efforts. As part of that, Congress is looking at potential bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements to promote the financial recovery of both of our countries, as well as pandemic preparedness in the future. I mentioned the PPE supply chain a minute ago. A key priority for Congress is to further cooperate with the EU with respect to PPE, other vulnerable supply chains, which I'll talk about in a minute, for API and medical devices. And finally, as noted, there's a desire to join with the EU in combating misinformation coming from some of our competitor countries regarding vaccine in a manner that's sophisticated and able to really take on the vast amount of distribution that's percolating through the internet and sort of ecosystem of the web, Facebook, and all those other platforms. So let me spend a few minutes talking about the life sciences sector and supply chains in particular. One learning that we've had in the States over the past year is just the stark illustration of the weakness in the U.S. and international supply chain for key products. The Biden administration has cited decades of underinvestment in public policy choices that have led to a fragile supply chain here in the US. According to the Biden administration, unfair trade practices by competitor nations such as India and China, and the prioritization of low-cost labor, just-in-time production, and focus on short-term returns over long-term investment have hollowed out the U.S. industrial base. Private sector innovation and robust investment by the U.S. government allowed the U.S. to strengthen supply chains during the COVID pandemic. But the U.S. remains critically dependent on imports for a range of key pharmaceutical products and generic drugs, which represent in the U.S. 90% of all prescriptions filled. The Biden has noted that 87% of manufacturing production for generic drugs takes place overseas, the large majority of which is in China and India. So it's a key priority both for Biden and Congress as a matter of geopolitics and strategy to decouple our industrial base from China. And what that means as a practical matter is that opportunities, manufacturing and otherwise, to partner not only with building out our domestic supply chain, but also using manufacturing in our allied countries like Germany is a real opportunity for us to partner. So, for their part, Biden and the EU have expressed interest in intensifying cooperation by devising a common approach to strategic and economic concerns posed by China. Biden is re-examining U.S. trade policy toward China as we speak, and is, as I noted earlier, seeking to enter into further free trade agreements with allies like Germany to help move us away or to decouple from China, as I noted earlier. The U.S. intends to expand multilateral diplomatic engagement on supply chain vulnerabilities, particularly through the G7. And the U.S. is exploring initiatives and mechanisms through international finance and otherwise across certain key sectors, including semiconductors, large capacity batteries, critical minerals and materials and minerals, and pharmaceuticals and APIs that have been deemed sort of critical to a resilient sector, but is too weighted toward China at this point. So one example of pending legislation that Congress has issued related to supply chain resiliency is the Essential Medicines Strategic Stockpile Act of 2020, which is pending here in the States. And what that would do is put a bunch of money and allow Congress to establish a mechanism where we in the States can maintain a supply of generics that we deem essential to U.S. healthcare. The opportunity is that that supply doesn't necessarily need to come from American manufacturers. It can come from allied manufacturers as well. So I think as we move to the next few years, there'll be a real opportunity for the U.S. and Germany and others in Europe to cooperate on building an international supply chain, not just one here in the States. So let me, given my sort of focus here in the U.S. On the FDA, let me close with a few notes about FDA's conduct during the pandemic and what we may see in the future. It's evident that FDA took unprecedented steps to expedite the development and review of new vaccines, therapeutics, tests, and other devices intended to address the pandemic. FDA's authorized 3 vaccines, more than 10 therapeutics, and more than 400 COVID-related diagnostic tests over the past year. The successful elements of FDA's approach may guide the establishment of new policies that will help speed the development of innovative therapies in the future. For instance, many of the vaccines and therapies that FDA has authorized are based on platform technologies like messenger RNA and viral vectors, which can speed development across multiple indications. So FDA is sort of taking the lesson learned of how they sort of expedited vaccine development based on these platform technologies and determining where we can apply those learnings in the future to expedite development here in the US. One area that is of particular interest to me, the FDA has significantly relaxed sort of the traditional and historical requirements for clinical trials. typically a subject would have to go to the institution, be consented at that institution in person by the doctor, and have their treatment monitored through their course of the protocol by the study team. FDA has issued a series of guidance documents over the past year that have facilitated remote monitoring, the ability to obtain remote consents, and essentially do these clinical trials many times for significant risky products in a decentralized manner, which provides the opportunity for more international work. I've seen my clients increase significantly the amount of ex-US sites that we're using in clinical trials, particularly in Germany, and the opportunity to assess data in a remote fashion that allows for the more rapid progress of these studies. For instance, one of the vaccine sponsors here in the US collected 90% of the data remotely for their product and submitted it to the FDA. So I think there'll be real opportunities for companies that need to progress products through the clinical trial process to do those studies in a rapid and expeditious fashion based on the success that we've seen over the past year in the pandemic. Where have we seen a downside? Well, it's on inspections. FDA, immediately when the pandemic began, canceled all inspections, particularly of overseas manufacturers. Understandable, but what that has led to is the inability of sponsors and manufacturers to get their products approved. It's often the case that before FDA will approve a new drug or device, they will conduct an inspection or require an inspection of a manufacturing facility before they will approve the product. 68 companies here in the States have seen their applications delayed due to FDA's failure to conduct what they deem to be a requisite inspection. Many of those manufacturers that have seen delayed applications are based outside the US with manufacturing facilities in Germany and other countries. And while FDA has sort of announced tools such as remote evaluations, use of trusted partners, such as regulatory authorities overseas to inspect these facilities, they've really been recalcitrant and unable to help move these applications forward in a manner that helps FDA meet the deadline and gets new therapies out to the market. So that's an issue that we in the States continue to see as a real impediment to FDA's progress on some novel and important therapies. And we hope that over the next 6 months, if the pandemic relaxes, that we'll begin to see FDA send inspectors out or to further engage with the partner healthcare authorities overseas in jointly sort of monitoring these manufacturing locations and making sure that these medications get through the system. So I hope that helps provide sort of some background on Biden, Congress, and FDA with respect to the approach to the pandemic and priorities moving forward. Kristof, I'm curious to hear your perspective as well.
Excellent. So indeed, thanks, Ben, for the great overview and the current status and recent trends. And indeed, Kristof, we are, after the US perspective and angle, of course, we are excited to hear your thoughts from probably a little bit from Europe, but also from a representative of a big corporate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Ben. I'm Kristof. I have been working in multiple geographies: Belgium, Holland, France, Germany, also in different industries, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson. And a lot of what Ben already has shared resonates with me and I think makes a lot of sense. And I think what we've been observing in the last couple of months are really, again, some encouraging dynamics and ongoing dialogues. But maybe also let me give a little bit of perspective from the industry and also from the companies. And it is my key belief that companies should operate globally. Based in Europe, based in the US, I think the key to success is that we operate with a global perspective. Because sharing knowledge, sharing resources, sharing new technologies, and collaboration are must-dos for success. And I would like to use the pandemic a little bit as an example. I think if there's one thing that the COVID-19 pandemic learned us is that if we don't fix it everywhere, we are basically not fixing it anywhere. Because only a couple of days ago, we see again the news popping up of new mutations. So if we don't nip this in the bud, then we will not be released from this ever. And I think if you look at the research and the manufacturing on a lot of the COVID vaccines out there was done in Europe. And I think by and through the collaboration, we could see that many vaccines were developed and manufactured in an unseen record pace. And I think it's a little bit the same in some other areas. We need to share the resources. We must collaborate. And I'm thinking about key challenges as sustainability, the environment, resources and the scarcity that we're faced with sometimes, and so on and so on, global safety. So I think if you look at what healthcare really has to offer, and that is one of the key insights also from the COVID-19 pandemic, is that it's not only people living longer and healthier. Healthcare and access to healthcare also offers economic stability, welfare, joy, and security. And what really resonated with me, what Ben mentioned, is that we also have to look very broadly there. For instance, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has specifically been developed so it can be shipped to anywhere. It can also be deployed in third world countries, and we must make sure that we don't favor one or the other population over another. Now, I think if you look at some of the trends that we've been observing, a little bit more nationalistic, a little bit more individualistic maybe, I think that is not the way forward. I think future forward from a global point of view is everybody prospers or nobody prospers. If you look at key topics like poverty, migration, and so on, those are things you cannot tackle in one area alone. It would be like thinking that one country could fix all by itself the ecological and climate challenges that all of us together are facing. We need to do that together. And I think also on that one, spreading the dependency from one geography or one population across the world is the much safer way forward. First of all, it will give certainty and more consistency of supply. It will also make operations more locally, which is again good for the climate. So I'm a firm believer that even if there are European or US-based companies operating with a global or through a global lens in a very collaborative way is the way forward. And I would like to really make the shift here to the healthcare systems, but because we see very similar dynamics in the healthcare systems. And I think COVID was really a wake-up call to action for many healthcare systems. And I think what is required, it's specialization, it's collaboration in networks, it's incentivizing more based on the quality rather than on the volume and the activity in the systems. And I think the cross-country learnings can really accelerate these processes. If you look at the research and development, the innovation, a lot of the innovation still comes from Europe. Very often, where the collaboration brings a lot of value is the ability to scale it up. It's the ability to distribute it worldwide. But the innovation can come from anywhere, and we should be open-minded that innovation very often also comes from unexpected places. And if we don't look broadly through a global lens, we might miss out on disruptive innovations. And I think if we look at what should it drive forward, it should really drive forward outcomes. More the outcome than the activity. And I think there, what we can do specifically for the German healthcare landscape is to go to more centralization and specialization, the adoption of new technologies. Ben already mentioned the digital capabilities that got an accelerated development because of COVID, like sharing research data, clinical data, diagnostics, and so on in a much faster, almost intelligently automated way. That gave a lot of benefits. So I think if you look at the outcomes, whether it's clinical outcomes or it's the patient experience, it is also the affordability of the healthcare systems and going all the way up to personalized medicine. Those are key things that are now, or that will be enabled much faster because of the accelerated development of certain capabilities because of COVID as a wake-up call. And I think it was a long, ongoing era of suffering and complexity and struggling, but I think we should nurture all the learnings and the insights that came out of it. And I think in that way, by collaborating in healthcare on innovation, technology, and know-how, we are not only securing a sustainable, healthy world, but also an economically safe and environmental friendly world. And I very much agree that we need collaboration transatlantic between the US, the G7, but I think also that group should be able to have a perspective also on other geographies and less fortunate, because if we don't fix problems there, problems will just displace themselves, they won't be fixed. So those are a couple of insights and reflections and perspectives I wanted to share on top of what Ben already shared. And I must say, I see some encouraging dynamics again in the last couple of months.
Many thanks, Kristof. And yeah, despite your different angles from region and one lawyer, one from the practice, I think indeed many areas where you agree and where you have the same position. Probably one question to start our discussion to both of you, and we already have also some questions here from our audience. But Ben, you mentioned the supply chain and the problems with the supply chain, and Kristof, you emphasized the need for transatlantic cooperation. So, giving you an example from our practice, I'm wondering how will this be done in practice? What is required? So we have a lot of clients, and this example is quite, I think, a standard example. A client who is producing medical devices has parts of his production in the US, needs this US production for their final production in Europe. And some months ago, we had the problem that the US administration, and Ben tackled this, that the US administration considered to put an export restriction or limitation on certain products. So in the end, it was very difficult for this client to produce products with then the final product to be imported in the US. So no one has an advantage on this. And also I think the US will have a disadvantage because some of those companies currently active in the US will then relocate their production to Europe. And in the end, there's no winner. So question to both of you, probably Kristof, you start with your view from the practice. How can we solve this? And then to Ben, what is required in particular from the US regulatory administration, or probably from the European German legislator to stop this, I think, not very helpful trade barriers?
I would first of all agree that it's not a very healthy practice. And I'm not the expert on the regulatory requirements or guidance that it needs, but I think very often what leads us to issues like this is short-term thinking rather than long-term thinking. As you said, in the end, because the export couldn't happen, the final product that maybe was destined for the US market wasn't able in the end to be shipped. So I think if we go to long-term thinking and better play out the different scenarios, what does this mean? And make sure that everybody has an understanding of the impact of the decisions, that could fix a lot of things. How that should be laid down in agreements or from a regulatory point of view, I am sure that Ben has more expertise in that area.
Well, to me, first and foremost, it sort of harkens back to a point that you made, Kristof, about the need to sort of view uh, healthcare and getting out of the pandemic as not an issue for me as an American or you as a German within our own country, but rather a global issue that needs to be addressed globally. And as part of that, one of the themes that, or sort of policies that led to the issue that Henning flagged, is that it was sort of every man for himself, every country for himself in the early days of the pandemic, without sort of focusing on who can be our allies and partners in progressing our response to the pandemic forward versus who's undermining that effort. And as I flagged in my intro, a strategic pivot that's underway here in the States is trying to move manufacturing away from China, India, et cetera, to the US, and more to the point, to our allies as well. So, I do think these sort of isolated, hopefully, cases where you have an export issue and export control will go away as FDA sort of in Congress reorients to a ally strategy of viewing a supply chain not just as a domestic animal, so to speak, but rather a sustainable supply chain with our allies, which will require more transparency, more communications, identification of these issues before they occur, et cetera. And, at the end of the day, a company in a position like Henning's client needs to learn how to advocate to FDA and to other regulatory authorities about the implications of what can be a knee-jerk decision to impose some sort of export restriction.
Excellent. Okay, so if you like, let's probably switch to two questions raised by the audience, and they're a little bit connected. They both tackle our recent federal elections here in Germany. And the one question is, as such, what should a new federal government in Germany need to do first to ensure that we have more partnerships of companies? They raised, sorry to Johnson & Johnson, but the example tackled is BioNTech, Pfizer. So how can we have more partnerships of companies cross-border developing innovative pharmaceuticals? So what is your view? And question, I think, goes to both of you. Probably Ben, if you like to start, what would be your wish for more cooperation to the new German government?
I'm not an expert on German law, but I can only speak to sort of my own experience and collaborations with German entities and clinical trials with German hospitals and institutions. That a real concern of my US client base are sort of the intellectual property distinctions between our two jurisdictions, and the likelihood that by collaborating with a German entity, by conducting activities at a German hospital, they may be forfeiting or allowing some access to their proprietary intellectual property related to their compound or device. So it's a disincentive to taking those chances because, for a developmental stage company, their value is sort of built into their patents and their intellectual property. So, one thing that has historically bedeviled some of my clients and that, I think could really facilitate those types of interactions, sort of an IP sort of level set of having more transparency and a more aligned system such that companies are more prone or apt to engage in activities in ex-US jurisdictions where it may be less clear.
Kristof?
Yeah, I would agree on a lot of that, Ben. I think the intellectual property is very often a hurdle or could make people a little bit nervous or hesitant. I think on top of that, it's important that the government makes collaboration easy, but also sharing the data. So if you look at data privacy regulations, those sometimes are blockers. I think also we should have frameworks or enablers to have public-private collaborations, because very often the innovation, there's a risk to it. So if we could go to risk sharing and we could have public-private partnerships, or we could set up incubators where there is an incentive, but also I would say the risk of innovating is reduced. I think that's a stimulation. I think besides that, I think the more restrictions you see, the less innovation. So the question to the government could be, how do you make sure that you still keep an overview on compliance, on the legality of things, without overdoing the restrictions?
Okay, and the second question tackles the same, the recent elections, and the question is to both of you, what would be your one wish towards the new government to be better prepared for the next pandemic? Kristof, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think maybe first of all, credits to the German government. I think there's always something you can remark on everything, but overall, I think the way that Germany managed the pandemic was, depending on from where you're looking, but from where I'm looking at it, very well done. So I think if you look at the impact, if you look at the way things were doing, so I think there were absolutely a lot of things that the German government and German society did right. I think what could be good for the next pandemic, it's again setting up that collaboration, because the chance that the cause of the next pandemic just is going to come out of Germany is small. So you need to have a system in place that you can connect and get your hands on information about something happening somewhere else in the world really fast. Because if there's a next pandemic and you want to really ring fence it or contain it, getting access to the information is key. So I think I would encourage the government to set up collaborations and partnerships where you exchange insights, trends, and data and information as soon as possible. That in combination with the pandemic preparedness task force or team, I think would go a long way.
Yeah, for my part, and speaking through from the U.S. perspective, more or less, certainly it was a credit to the FDA how quickly they were able to get vaccines and therapies through the emergency use authorization process here in the States, and just as important with Operation Warp Speed, the ability to stand up manufacturing. In parallel to that vaccine development, I think is a real success story and will serve as a guide in terms of future pandemics, of the ability to bring vaccines rapidly through the process and get them out to the public. I think where there was a real failing was on the supply chain side, and surprisingly, sort of the day-to-day stuff that you think we would have a plethora of that ran out right away, face masks, hand sanitizers, et cetera. I had clients in the early days of the pandemic, major clients that typically don't dabble in the FDA regulated space, asking, how do I make hand sanitizer for my employees? How do we make our own face masks? How do we manufacture this stuff? Because we can't get it anywhere else. And that was a learning that, boy, we are really reliant on supply chains originating in China and other countries that have a real opportunity to engage in mischief when it comes to sort of addressing these issues. So I anticipate, and what my hope is, and as I I think I've harped upon, it's a key congressional priority to make those supply chains more resilient. Whether that's here domestically or whether that's through our allied partners. So I would like to see more cooperation in terms of developing and sustaining supply chains for key medical devices, key generics, as I mentioned earlier, such that we don't suffer through the same issues during the next pandemic.
Probably, since as you're both experts, for the next topic is looking on the Trump and now the Biden administration. I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration put strong focus on national interests and America first. So what we've got here in Europe was a little bit that, of course, Biden, as he declared and announced, wanted to put more focus on partners, and Ben, you mentioned it, on the transatlantic allies. So the question is, Ben, do you see this already in respective activities in the US regulation, or are these only statements to be proven? And then the second part to Kristof, do you see already first impact in your daily practice, that there's a kind of more looking to the partners, more transatlantic headspace? Ben, probably you to start, whether you see any activities in that side already from the regulator.
Well, certainly here in the States, we remain significantly polarized politically, essentially 50-50, which to some degree has constrained the Biden administration's ability to sort of carry through their key objectives. Frankly, we still have a chunk of the population here that is still America first. Trump doesn't have Twitter, but he still has means to communicate his message. So there still is a recalcitrance on the part of our Republicans in Congress and others to be seen as internationalists or sort of facilitating increased cooperation. That being said, I think where there is bipartisan support is in the approach to China and the need to pivot away from China toward our allies. So what we're seeing in terms of pending legislation, et cetera, where there are opportunities for partnership are really through the prism of how do we throw off the yoke of the China manufacturing supply chain. And so I think that's where the opportunity will be for transparency. For FDA's part, it's been more words at this point, I would say, than substantive sort of regulatory policy or actions. One thing that I mentioned earlier that continues to bedevil my international clients is FDA's inability to get overseas and conduct inspections, or to really engage with partners, healthcare regulatory authorities in these other countries on conducting those inspections. So I would really like to see more engagement from FDA on the international level in sort of making sure that not only are domestic manufacturers, but overseas manufacturers that are trying to introduce new products to the States have a meaningful opportunity to do so.
Kristof, any impact on your daily business? Any changes from Trump to the Biden administration already visible?
I would say not that much. And it's something good, I would say, and it makes me proud to work for a company, and I think size matters in that area, that always called out the ambition to operate as a global company and everybody matters equally. And I think so what we've seen is the development of our vaccine. A lot of the work happened in the Netherlands, happened in Belgium, some of the work happened in the US. Those teams have been continuously collaborating. So even during, I would say, the peak of the Trump administration and the narrative that went with it, we didn't really feel it. We, I think, stayed, even as a US company, but with a global footprint, our company culture there was so strong that I didn't feel it in my day-to-day operational activities. And the same now with the Biden administration, not much impact visible for me. But I think it's because what matters there is also from the captains of industry is leadership. And be courageous enough to follow your own path. And if that is, we serve the global community with healthcare products, then you stay true to it and you stay loyal to it. So I hardly noticed anything.
I agree with your approach, and this is very important that we have, of course, corporates like Johnson & Johnson who have this mission. But needless to say, in the end, you're bound to the national and international regulatory frame. And if you have trade barriers, then of course it will become difficult for you. But okay, it's interesting to hear that you, in the end, have not seen a change so far, right?
Yeah.
Probably going back to the question, and there's an additional question on that topic, is we discussed how to improve and to be better prepared for the next pandemic. And indeed, we only discussed the national approach, US, Europe, Germany. Question to you, do you also see a, let's say, international framework that could help here? And if so, what would be the specific platform for that? Or is it a question simply of states and states cooperate? Or is it, for example, the UN or other institutions that should be active here as well, Ben?
Well, the WHO COVAX project that I mentioned earlier, I think is an example of where cooperation can really manifest in facilitating a response to the pandemic. And the U.S. contributed $4 billion to that effort, but it's meant to sort of leverage the collective learnings of all the countries and the vaccines and identifying, on a global basis, where to target resources to combat, the future pandemic. I think it's principally through WHO. We'll have the G7 and sort of those other instrumentalities that have been in existence for quite some time. I'm not sure that we'll see a new organization or anything like that. But at the end of the day, as we've seen from the yo-yo in the States between Trump and Biden, those programs will only be as good as sort of the national authorities that are implementing them. So while I'm optimistic today about international cooperation, come back to me in 2024 if Trump's the candidate again to see, if that will be sustainable over the long term.
Kristof?
Yeah, not so much to add on what Ben said. It's not really my area of expertise. But I would say I agree on the point that it's really about the implementation. And I think another point is that maybe it's not so much about implementing more frameworks and regulations, but taking away restrictions or hurdles.
Agree. Probably let's move to public budgets and financial spending and costs. What we hear when we talk to players in the healthcare industry and also to the politicals, I recently spoke to the secretary of the healthcare ministry. There's I would say, quite a contradiction in the approach. As the one voice group of voices say, due to the pandemic, we had a lot of public spending and costs in the healthcare sector. And therefore we have to earn the money back, and there will be a kind of reduction in the public sector or in the healthcare industry. And the other group of voices say completely the different. They say, oh no, the pandemic showed that healthcare is very important, and that we need the nurses, and that we need the big pharma and the medical device companies. So they say, no, it showed that we will have more public spending. And Kristof, you are quite familiar with the German healthcare system and with hospitals. So what is your expectation? What do you hear, and what do you expect from the public side? Cost cutting or more spending?
Well, we will find out in the end. I think it always has to stay affordable. So increasing budgets year over year exponentially is probably not a viable solution. I think if you look about the two schools of thought, I'm a firm believer that we should invest and spend on healthcare, because as I said, it doesn't only bring people living longer and happier and healthier lives, it also brings economic welfare, stability, security. It brings so much more. Now, I think the question is not so much on doing more budgets, less budgets. It's more on, for me, for the German healthcare system, doing things differently. And I think one of the things that the German healthcare system needs urgently, mainly in the hospital landscape, is a focus from activity and volume-driven incentivation to a more quality and outcome-based incentivation. And in that way, we might see a recalibration of numbers of procedures. I think we all, or a lot of people, are aware that for certain procedures, Germany per capita is by far performing the most. And I think that is a logical consequence. If you pay for volume, you get volume. So I think one of the first good steps that the German hospital landscape could go through is, first of all, centralize and specialize so that not every of the 2,000 hospitals does complex surgery, but you centralize it in centers of excellence. In that way, you can also work on efficiency and effectiveness and better clinical outcomes, but also incentivize on the quality of the outcome and not just on the activity. And I think those would be already two very good steps.
And Kristof, we always have the discussion whether you should have more private player in the hospital system or have certain areas in public hands. What do you think, in particular with regard to the pandemic? Is it helpful to have private players, private investors investing in hospital, medical devices, and MVZ systems? Or should we have some core areas like university hospitals staying in the public hand?
Well, I think one of the ideas or possible solutions for the German system could be that you go to a 3-tier model, meaning that very close to the people, there is access to healthcare, whether it's an emergency room, you can go there, there's the general physician and the first aid in the hospital. Maybe when you talk surgical oncology, once you go colorectal cancer, lung cancer, cardiac surgery, you have centers of excellence. And I think it absolutely makes sense that there are private players in there, but then don't pay them for volume or activity. Pay them for outcomes and negotiate between the healthcare insurance companies that the better your outcome, we're okay to pay you more in one DRG if you did the effort to collect your data and you can demonstrate that you're performing better than the national average. Where I see the universities and the public spaces is very often in tier 3, where I think, I'll give a simple example. It wouldn't make sense that in universities, they do a lot of primary knee and hip replacements because it's just too expensive of a setting. But would it be great to centralize high complex care or new therapies and new technologies in those public university centers? Absolutely. So I think it's about segmenting and working with a 3-tier model. And then I think there's place for public and for private.
Okay, time is running. We only have 2 minutes left, and I promised that we shall be on time. So probably what would be your, let's say, closing remarks? What would be your wishes? And sorry, we have not prepared this, so you can be spontaneous. Respectively, the wish from the US to Europe and the other way around. Ben, what would be your wish to improve the transatlantic relations in the healthcare sector? 1, 2, 3 wishes, you have 3. And Kristof has a little bit more time to consider what he wants to wish.
My wish is that FDA will not sacrifice sort of the day-to-day effort of life sciences and device companies in Europe to develop new therapies, technologies unrelated to COVID, that FDA doesn't sacrifice efforts to facilitate, sort of streamline those processes by dedicating resources solely to the COVID pandemic. As I sort of flagged with the inspectional issue earlier, a lot of the FDA resources over the past year have been solely dedicated to the response, and a lot of other program areas have languished. So my goal is that a company can have a transparent process here in the States with a reasonable basis to estimate timelines for approvals, for inspections and the like, which is what we've lacked over the past 18 months. So that's what I would hope to see over the next few years.
Kristof, what are your 2, 3 Christmas wishes to the Biden administration from a German corporate perspective?
Well, first of all, I would like to see that healthcare is not so much looked at as a cost, but as something that brings a lot of value, like I already mentioned, in different areas that matter. Secondly, what I would hope for is that there's a big stimulation for cooperation, networking, and sharing knowledge and expertise, because for me, that will accelerate the progress we are able to make, not just COVID related, but just healthcare wise, taking it to the next level.
these were perfect closing remarks. Many thanks. So thanks to you, to the two panelists. Thanks to our sponsor, Johnson & Johnson. Thanks to the audience and the questions that were raised in the Q&A. It worked perfectly. Many thanks. Yes, have a good evening, and I hope we will make the world a little bit better, and in particular the transatlantic cooperation in the healthcare sector. Many thanks, and a good evening to all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.